Not long ago in a nearby land lived a king. He was a good king that cared about his people. One day he climbed to the top of the tallest tower in his castle and he looked out over the land. He saw things that should have made him very happy. He saw a great forest with many trees, farmland that grew abundant crops, and through the middle of the kingdom ran a river that was full of fish. He should have been a very happy king. He should have had a big smile on his face, but instead he had a big frown. For over the kingdom had settled a great sadness, like a big dark cloud that had settled over the land. Nobody seemed to really care about anybody else. Nobody really talked to anybody else, and, well, worst of all were the children. He hardly ever saw them out laughing and running and playing, and he knew that something must change. If this sadness wasn't taken away, the kingdom itself would be destroyed. The king decided to call a meeting of the bravest and the brightest, the most educated in the entire kingdom, and present the problem to them. Surely someone must know the answer to how the kingdom could be saved. The next day the great hall of the castle was filled to overflowing. The people wondered why had the king called them there, and then suddenly he appeared. "My loyal subjects," he began to address them, "the kingdom is in great danger of being destroyed. For you see, as I look around, I observe many disturbing things. Why, even though we have great forest with many trees, some of our people have no place to live. And our farmland, although we grow more crops than we could possibly ever eat, some of the people in the kingdom go to bed hungry at night. And worst of all are the children. I never see them laugh and play, and why, some of them are even afraid to come out of their own homes at night. You must understand, if something is not done, this kingdom will die." People began to talk among themselves. They did not realize it was such a terrible problem. And then suddenly, "Your Majesty, what about the royal knight? Perhaps he can ride out into the kingdom and find out who's causing all these problems, and he can defeat them." Oh, the king's frown only got bigger, for you see, he had already tried that, and it hadn't worked. And then from the other side of the room, "Your Majesty, what about the royal wizard? Perhaps somebody has cast an evil spell over the land, and the wizard can find out who it is and stop him." Once again, the king's frown only got bigger. It was a good suggestion, but he had already tried it. And one by one, the people made suggestions, and although they had good ideas, none of them were things he hadn't already tried. He was beginning to lose all hope, for it seemed as though there wasn't going to be an answer, and the kingdom was doomed. When suddenly, from the very back of the room came a voice. "Your Majesty, I believe I can help." Everybody turned to look to see where the voice had come from, and a man began to make his way forward to the king. He was an ordinary-looking man in ordinary clothes. Except for over his shoulder he carried a large leather sack. He made his way up to right where the king stood and set the sack on the ground, and the king looked at him and said, "Excuse me, do I know you, sir?" "Oh, I think not, your Majesty. I'm but a weaver in the village below. I make cloth for a living." This sounded rather strange, for the king could not remember having invited a weaver to his meeting, and the crowd began to think the same thing, and they began to murmur among themselves, "A weaver? A weaver? Why, what is a weaver doing here? What could a weaver do? I mean, they're not wealthy, and he certainly doesn't have much of an education. Well, there's nothing he could do to help us with this problem. He's just a weaver. Get him out of here." The king listened to the crowd for just a moment, and then he held up his hand to stop them. "Listen. We have already tried all the things we could think of, and none of them have worked. Perhaps we should listen to this man." He looked at him very closely again and said, "Do you think that you can help this kingdom, sir?" "Why, yes, Majesty, I believe I can, but you must agree to do exactly as I say." The king had to think about that for a moment because, well, as king, he was much more used to giving orders than taking them, and he wasn't quite sure he was ready to turn his kingdom over to a mere weaver, but he knew something had to be done. "What would you have me do, sir?" "Well, your Majesty, gather all the people of your kingdom together. Have them meet outside of the castle here tomorrow morning. I will return, and I will then tell everyone what must be done." Then the man casually picked up his sack, and tossing it over his shoulder, he strode away. The king immediately sent riders all throughout the kingdom and told everybody to gather in front of the castle the next day. And the next morning was quite a sight. Every person, if they were able to walk, they were there. The king and the people both watched and waited anxiously to spot the weaver coming, and pretty soon somebody did. And as he came up the road, the crowd parted so that the weaver could get to where the king stood right in front of the castle. The weaver was dressed as he was the day before, and he still carried that large leather sack over his shoulder. When he reached the king, he set the sack on the ground right in front of him. The king had had the whole night, because he had not slept, to think about what was going to happen that day. And he remembered that sack that the weaver had carried with him everywhere he had gone, and he had determined that perhaps there must be some magic in that sack. That's how the weaver was going to save the kingdom. "Excuse me, sir, but could you tell me, do you have some magic in that sack? Is that how you're going to save the kingdom?" "Magic, your Majesty? Well, perhaps we'll just have to see." Now all the young people in the village had wormed and pushed and shoved their way to the front of the crowd, and a bunch of them stood around the man as he opened up the sack. He stuck his hand inside, and many expected him to pull out a magic wand or a book of incantations, but instead he pulled out the end of a bright red ribbon. "Why, it's a magic ribbon! He's got a magic ribbon there! He's got a magic ribbon!" "Is that a magic ribbon, sir?" "We shall see, your Majesty, we shall see." The weaver looked around, and he spotted a young girl standing over to the side of the crowd, and he motioned for her to come forward. He handed her the end of the ribbon, and then he spoke to the crowd. "This is what must be done. This ribbon must go down every street, through every alley, across every bridge, through the forest, over the mountain, all the way to the sea. And there are two very important things. Everyone must help. None can stand aside. And the ribbon must never touch the ground. If it touches the ground, the magic will stop." The weaver motioned for the girl to begin walking. Well, of course, she took just a few steps, and as the ribbon pulled out of the sack, it began to sag and had almost touched the ground when somebody from the crowd called, "Stop!" Everyone froze. It was as if they didn't know what to do. And then suddenly a young boy stepped forward from the crowd, and very carefully he slid his hand under the ribbon, and then he lifted it high up into the air. Then he and the girl began to walk, and the ribbon began to pull from the sack again, and each time it would almost touch the ground, another young person would come forward and take the ribbon, and another, until finally the adults called on. They were a little slow, but they figured it out, and they began to take the ribbon. The banker, the blacksmith, the lawyer, the man that collects the garbage. One by one they took the ribbon, and that ribbon began to stretch, and it went down every street, through the alleys, across the bridges, through the forest, over the mountains, until it reached the sea. And every person in the kingdom stood holding the ribbon. Most of them held it high above their head to make sure it wouldn't touch the ground. The king turned to the weaver and asked, "When does the magic begin?" "Why, your Majesty, it's already begun. Come with me and I'll show you." The weaver took the king's arm, and they began to walk behind the line of people. They went just a little ways when they stopped behind two people. One of them was a young girl, and she was dressed in a ragged dress, and it was cold that morning, and she shivered as she almost tried to hold the ribbon around her as if it were a coat, and standing next to her was a man dressed in the nicest clothes. He looked at that little girl and he said, "Little girl, where is your coat? You shouldn't be out on a day like today without a coat." "I have no coat, sir." "No coat? Why, that's ridiculous. Everybody should have a coat. You see, I'm the town tailor. I make coats for a living. Why, I have closets full of coats, big ones and little ones and long ones and short ones and every color imaginable. Why, no coat? Why, that won't do. But what could, I have it. When we're through here, you come with me to my shop. I'm sure that I can find a coat that will fit you, but if I can't, why, I will simply make you one. Why, that would be no problem at all." "Oh, no coat. Now, that's ridiculous. Everybody needs a coat." The king heard this, and he was amazed. Why, indeed, this must be a magic ribbon. And the magic had already begun. The man actually cared about the little girl. Now, his frown was not gone, but it had straightened up a wee bit. They walked a little further down the line and stopped behind two more of the people from the kingdom, and well, one of them was a rather frail-looking man, bent and seemed almost too weak to even hold the ribbon up to his shoulder. Very thin and weak-looking indeed, and standing next to him was a rather round lady, and she wore a white apron and a tall white hat. She looked at the man beside her and said, "What is that terrible sound I hear?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. I guess it must be my stomach. I didn't eat breakfast this morning, and it doesn't seem to like that." "Breakfast? It looks to me, sir, like you've missed more than one meal." "Well, yes, the last 2 meals, indeed." "2 meals? Why, I can barely go 2 minutes without eating something. It shows, of course, but you see, I'm the village baker. I make the best breads and cakes and cookies in the entire kingdom. If you were hungry, why didn't you come to my shop and get something to eat?" Well, as it turned out, the man had lost his job. He had no money to buy food. Oh, the baker removed her hat and scratched her head, and she thought, my goodness, no job, no money, no food. Why, that's certainly not right. Nobody should go hungry because they don't have money to buy food. But what is it that I can do? I have it. My fine fellow, when we're through here, you come with me to my shop, and I will give you something to eat to build your strength up, and then I'll give you one of my biggest baskets of my best breads and cakes and cookies, and you take them out to the kingdom and sell them for me. Bring me the money back. I'll pay you a fair wage, and both of us will be helped. You will have a job and money to buy food, and I will have someone to help me." Well, the king heard this, and he was indeed amazed. His frown now had turned into a straight line across his face. He was amazed. This magic was indeed powerful. "Show me more, sir. Is there more?" "Oh, yes, your majesty, much more." He took the king's arm, and they walked all the way down to the river. And there stood 2 men. Tall and strong and proud, they held that ribbon high above their heads. Only they stood back to back, not looking at each other. For you see, one of them had dark skin, one had light. One lived on one side of the river, and one lived on the other, and, well, they figured that since they didn't look the same, and they didn't live in the same neighborhood, there obviously wasn't anything for them to talk about. But of course, neither one of them, wanting to be there, was not willing to lay the ribbon down. He did not want to be accused of breaking the magic. They had no idea how long they would be there. It could be an hour, a day, a week. Well, as most of us know, that would be quite a long time to go without talking. So finally, one of the men figured perhaps it wouldn't hurt to just talk to the other man. So he turned and said, "Excuse me, sir, don't you have the farm on the other side of the river from me?" "Why, yes, I do." "Well, you grow the most amazing crops. You grow watermelons so big it takes 2 people to carry them." "On my side of the river, I can grow nothing." "Oh, yes, but on your side of the river, you have such tall, straight trees. I wish I had trees like that, for you see I barely have one tree left on my side. If I had some trees like that, why, I could build some fine barns, for you see I don't have enough to put my crops in anymore. Oh, the man thought for a moment. Perhaps we could work out something. What do you mean, sir? Well, if you were to give me the secret of growing crops like yours, I would be willing to give you some trees. Well, I think I could do better than that. If you were willing to give me some trees, I would be willing to come to your side of the river and show you how to grow the crops. Well, I can beat that, sir. If you were to come to my side of the river and help me, I would be glad to bring the trees to your side of the river and help you build your barns. And they went back and forth, and the king stood there amazed. Here were two men who thought because they were different, they had nothing in common. Just by talking, had found out they were more alike than they were different. The king was amazed at the power of this ribbon. And as he and the weaver began to walk back toward the palace, the king had to know, where did you get such a powerful magic ribbon, sir? Where did you find such an incredible thing? Now they had almost reached the palace, and the man pointed. The king looked and noticed the sack as it sat there at the front, and the wind had begun to blow, and the breeze had lifted the end of the ribbon out of the sack, and it began to float in the air. The king suddenly remembered what the weaver had told him. If the ribbon touched the ground, the magic would stop. He couldn't let that happen. He turned and looked for somebody to order, go grab the ribbon, but everybody was already holding it. And he turned but the weaver was gone. He was the only one left. But he was a king. But the wind began to die down, the breeze began to slow, and the ribbon began to fall towards the ground. Forgetting he was a king, the king began to run as fast as he could, but unfortunately he was a short little king with short little legs, and even though he ran, he didn't cover much ground, and as he watched, the ribbon began to fall and fall and fall, and he knew that he had to do something, so at the last moment he dove into the dirt and missed it. The ribbon fell to the ground. The king lay there, his royal robes covered with dirt. His crown lay on the ground. He held the ribbon in his hands. He slowly got to his feet. That big smile, the one that he'd had after he'd heard the two men talking, had turned into a frown even bigger than the one he'd started with. It was all for nothing. The magic was gone. The ribbon had touched the ground. He slowly got to his feet, and a tear began to fall down his cheek. His kingdom was lost. But then he noticed something very strange. The people were talking. Children were running and playing, and problems were being solved, and things had changed. The birds were singing, the bells began to ring, and he didn't understand it. He stood there looking at the ribbon, but the magic was... And then it came to him, all at once. It really wasn't a magic ribbon. There'd never been any magic in that cloth. The magic was in the hearts and the hands of those that held the ribbon. They were the ones that made the difference. And it was the beginning. You might hear something like this during the Miss America contest. They ask them, what would you like to do with your life? And they say,
Oh, I would like to bring peace and love to the whole world. I want to start a foundation for homeless children. I want to feed all the hungry people in the world. I want, and they go on and you're thinking, oh my gosh, do we believe this? I don't want to sound that way. But I do want to tell you this. You don't live in this world alone. Even though sometimes you might wish you did, you don't. Now, you're responsible for yourself. That's pretty obvious. That's where you make those important choices, the ones that change your life forever. Good choices or bad choices, you're the one that has to make them. There's some choices your mother or father or other people can make for you. Somebody decides how fast you can drive on the freeway. Somebody decides what you're going to have at school lunch that day. Those are choices you don't have anything to do with, but how you react to those things are the choices that you make. The story, the red ribbon, I hope you got from that every person has something to offer to somebody else. Maybe not to everybody else, but to somebody else. Take the time to look around you. See what you can do. Once again, sounds like Miss America. To make this a better world. But hey, I could handle a better world. Give it a shot. See what you can do. Raise the standard.